Hi guys, welcome to Novum. Today we're going to be looking at superhero movies and the incredible rise to popularity superheroes have had over the last decade as a response to the 9/11 attacks. It's a big topic, it's very vague in places and very specific in places, but hopefully there's going to be a lot for everyone to learn. One thing before we get started is to remember that this is simply a reading. It's not definitive or monolithic. We're going to be looking at an enormous range of media and intertwined meanings, and it would be foolish to suggest that they're all representative of one particular thing. But what we can do is make suggestions as to how these movies have grown with, and in some cases because of, the social and political climate of the world around them. Before we get started, let's just make that definite by establishing a couple of facts and terms that are going to help us understand all of this and put things in perspective. First is the idea of national manhood. I'll be talking a lot about this, pulling mainly from the absolutely incredible text National Manhood by Dana Nelson. If this sort of thing is of interest to you, then I 100% suggest picking it up. As always, every text I'll be discussing will be linked in the video description. National manhood refers to our social understanding of nation powers, masculinity, military power, and dominance on the international stage as all being intrinsically linked. It's closely linked, in fact often synonymous, with the idea of sovereign masculinity, a dominant mode of masculinity that defines and often is defined by the nation power it resides within. For example, during the height of the British Empire, all the way through World War I, there was great stock put in the militaristic prowess and bravery of the British soldier, and at the same time, the buffoonery and carelessness of their commanding officers. This became popularized by the phrase lions led by donkeys, and ultimately this would shape personal and international understandings of what being British meant, a tough working class lauded over by an at times ridiculous aristocracy. This is national manhood at work. Similarly, the French, due to many tragic circumstances, garnered an unfortunate reputation for cowardice, their men often seen as lovers rather than fighters. Again, this is national manhood at work, and it demonstrates how fragile a thing it can be considering the French have more military victories than any other nation power. This is especially true of the USA, a country built on masculine endeavor and violent dominance that became the runaway leader in military force and superpower status over the course of the 20th century. But let's save America because we're going to be looking at it in depth in a second. Next, let's establish how important comic books and the superhero genre have been in shaping American masculinity. It's undeniable that when most of our standout household name characters were created, it was very much with a hard nationalistic edge. Superman may no longer be a grizzled war vet, but back when he was first created, he was absolutely fighting Nazis. Captain America is an obvious one here. He's killed more Nazis than Steven Spielberg films. Even Wonder Woman, a Caucasian ancient Greek living in South America, was used for often incredibly racist pro-American nationalist propaganda. Then came the 1950s, and moral panics ensued regarding increasingly violent and sexual representations appearing in comic books. This would be one of the first major moral panics over censorship, and in 1954 the Comics Code and the Comics Code Authority began stripping all the material perceived to be too edgy. This is vital to us because in doing so, what we were left with once the violence and sex was removed was the boyhood wish fulfillment of Golden Age comics. This would become the core, the soul of the comics we recognize throughout what's known as the Silver Age and essentially into the modern day. This decision, combined with the relatively hostile distribution method of pre-Geek Chic comic book shops, would ensure that comic readership for the next 60 years would be almost entirely male. So now we have an entertainment medium that was created largely as a propagandic tool, reduced down to fantasy fulfillment for boys and young men. When I say that over time comic books have shaped American masculinity, I think that would be putting it very lightly. Everything from ideas of America as an innocent nation or a purified Eden following World War II, to ideas of Orientalism that we'll look to later, to even the idea of what a man should look like and what the apex aesthetic of masculinity should be. All of it has been at least shaped in part by comic books. Now, I don't want to dwell for too long on this, but it's important that we establish as fact moving forward, so I'm flashing up on screen many different theory and biography texts on comic books and their relationship with masculinity for you to check out in your own time. It should also be pointed out that while comic books and the superhero genre have had enormous influence on American masculinity, and indeed Western masculinity as a whole, the reverse is also true. As social ideals have shifted, comic books have moved with them. In the 1970s, for example, female characters were largely just objects of desire, and just as we've seen in the real world, this is simply no longer acceptable. Female characters now inhabit some of the most popular titles, and for the most part are written with a lot more respect. Now, the last bit of groundwork I need to set up for you guys that superhero movies and comic books were changed, did acknowledge, and ultimately were and are concerned with the 9/11 attacks and the subsequent war on terror. So very quickly, Spider-Man 1, the Twin Towers have to be removed in post, and we're given an extra scene in which the public of New York bands together to help Spider-Man, as well as the removal of a scene involving a helicopter being webbed between the Twin Towers. It's simply fact that that movie was altered because of 9/11. It's simply fact that we were given chilling panels like these ones I'm showing you right now, because these characters were so closely linked with America, with New York, that this was never something that could really be ignored. Following the 9/11 attacks, the superhero genre surged in popularity, particularly the MCU, an American-centric franchise, perhaps even New York-centric for a majority of it. The MCU is rife with citywide destruction, stories of trauma, examination of uncontrolled military intervention, and it's all of this and more that we're going to be examining here in this video. The point of this introduction is that simply and factually, entirely without the analysis or reading of subtext, that this genre has been shaped by the 9/11 attacks and has been helping shape notions of national manhood from long before that. So while I said at the start that this is a reading, and while it would still be unfair and silly to say anything as definitive as the Marvel films are only about 9/11, it would perhaps be more unfair to say that they simply are not. So we're going to start with an exploration of how America dealt with 9/11, specifically in terms of national manhood and how comics and superheroes were involved. From there, we're going to look at Iron Man in depth, mostly the first movie with other parts pulled from all over. After that, we're going to look at Captain America 1, 2, and 3, then Avengers 1 and 2, before finishing up right at the end with some Infinity War and Endgame stuff that I will tag with spoilers. If you want to just skip to certain parts or miss out all the deeper starting context and just get straight to the MCU, then all the chapter times are in the video description for you to skip away. Okay, lots to get through, so let's begin. On September 11th, 2001, 4 passenger planes leaving the northeastern US were hijacked by members of the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization. 1 plane was shot down in the air, 1 plane crashed into the Pentagon. The other 2 planes collided with the north and south towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. Within an hour and 42 minutes, both 110-story buildings had collapsed. 2,996 people were dead, and over 6,000 people were seriously injured. It represents the largest terrorist attack in the history of the world and the 4th largest loss of life on American soil. It was a moment of violent redefinition, a break from circular wisdom and status quo that destabilized American and Western society in a myriad of ways. Notably among them was the shattered image of national manhood, the absence of a once perceived immortality in the face of a devastating attack on home soil. Ever since the tragic events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the national manhood of America had been firmly cemented, the alpha dog in the pack due to sheer strength, advancement, and ill-gotten finance. But then came that day in 2001. The planes hit the towers and the world stopped turning for a moment, the bluster and bravery of its most powerful nation brought to its knees. And everyone held their breath, terrified what the beast would do in return. And that came, sure enough, 11 years of fire and fury. But in those days and weeks that followed the attack, there was a lull, an absence. Not just a minute's silence for a fallen hero, more of a hopelessness, the recognition of something lost that wasn't physical, more of an ideal, an epitome of greatness and human endeavor. American national manhood was in crisis, and the Bush government understood this all too well. If they were to get their people behind the vague yet demanding war efforts they had planned, they would need to reinvigorate belief in the American soldier, and to do that, they'd need to reinvigorate American national manhood. And so, to fill that absence, came a rush of efforts to bolster or redefine the construction of American heroic masculinity. There were many odd efforts at this, things such as French fries being renamed to freedom fries, most of them largely unsuccessful. But there was something slightly more insidious at work that in many ways would define the next decade of American military intervention. That is the notion of cowboy masculinity, as repopularized by George Bush following 9/11, and the presidency's efforts as a whole to focus on branding and heroic propaganda in order to garner support for the war on terror. Cowboy masculinity is pretty much what you'd expect from the title, extremely old school ideas of what a man should be from the time when men were men. Obviously, the cowboy mythos is heavily romanticized, but that didn't stop Bush's speechwriters from employing language such as "we'll smoke 'em out" and bringing the terrorists in dead or alive, and they'd round up Al-Qaeda and say "bring 'em on" as Iraqi rebels launched guerrilla attacks on US forces. And it worked. Bonnie Mann suggests that it harkened back to an era when male heroes in America were arrogant, simple-minded, and infallible. The confident bluster aimed to restore a sense of inviolability to a nation which had just had its absolute confidence in its own sovereignty challenged by 19 men with box cutters. Susan Faludi noted that following the attacks there was an undercurrent to American national manhood that the nation and its men had gone soft, suggesting this had a feminizing effect on the national psyche. She likens the repetition of the tower footage to that of national castration or being metaphorically sodomized. In fact, Faludi, Mann, and Frecaro all suggest that the subsequent War on Terror was pervaded with mentions of sexualized violence in an effort to correct this, to become the dominant party once again. Political cartoons of bombs ready to anally penetrate Saddam were rife, the slogan USA up Saddam's ass was written on tanks, even the phrase hijack this fags spray-painted onto missiles. All of it a symbolic effort to redeem national sovereignty and restore the power of the American phallus. Mann actually goes even further, suggesting this was also an act of redemption for the feminizing loss of Vietnam. By no means, however, was this effort to reinvigorate national manhood a solely governmental or militaristic one. It was countrywide. Further even, it was cultural, and when it comes to reinvigorating boyhood heroism and belief in American masculinity, there stood comic books. Marvel in particular had no choice but to deal with the fallout. Many of their characters lived and worked in close proximity with the Twin Towers. To quote The Guardian, the city that had served as a setting for countless superhero comics was attacked by 2 planes, and no knight in a bodysuit or on a shining surfboard intervened to prevent the catastrophe that followed. Only retrospectively, intervention became possible. Now, it'd take quite a while to wade through all the comics that have been published in tribute to 9/11, but there are a few standout ones we should look at. Most notably, for me at least, is The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, number 36, commonly referred to as the Black Issue, for its all-black cover and somber content. I would suggest everyone reads it. It deals with the subject matter in a fantastic way. I think actually this issue and Don DeLilio's The Falling Man are my 2 favourite texts that deal with the immediacy of the attacks, and both are well worth a read. The Black Issue sees Spider-Man, alongside other heroes, trying to comprehend the tragedy they were unable to prevent, as well as doing their best to respond to the disaster around them. It's deeply moving and full of striking imagery. Large focus is put on the New York emergency services as the real heroes of the occasion. Even well-known villains such as Doctor Doom and Magneto are present, standing in opposition to the horrors of the attack. Perhaps most notable is Spider-Man's observation of Captain America. He's the only one who could know, because he's been here before. I wish I had not lived to see this once. I can't imagine what it is to see this twice. The panels show Captain America stoic, eyes to the horizon with fist clenched, perhaps with a slight tear in his eye, but not weeping openly like everyone else, even Doctor Doom. The message is clear, and it's exactly what we're discussing. It's using Cap, the established World War II veteran, as an emblem of national manhood, an emblem that says, we've been here before, we've seen evil like this, and we've beaten it because of men like this. For the most part, the issue is extremely respectful of its subject matter. It goes out of its way to show New Yorkers as being diverse, and does a tremendous job of ensuring hate is not pointed towards a certain ethnicity or racial group, rather the corrupted minds of terrorists. It also implores America and coalition forces to show mercy, and not become the hatred they have sworn to eradicate. But it does bring a couple of problems with it that are relevant to our discussion here. For example, it does demonstrate quite clearly religious figures from different denominations as the spewers of hatred, a stance I'm sure that many of us agree with. Unfortunately, this came at a time when Islam was being vilified worldwide, and although the comic shows Muslim people as part of America, it also shows the Institute of Islam as a very clear enemy. Not only in this panel where a Muslim preacher is shown suggesting the attacks were God's will, but more troublingly further down when it describes madness in mosques, shouting down 14 centuries of earnest prayers, forgetting the lessons of crusades past. Now, not only does this seem to suggest that 9/11 has triggered a worldwide schism in Islam, in which seemingly 3/4 of all Muslims have now turned to war, the Crusades comment also brings worrying connotations. Yes, there are parallels. The Crusades may have been religious genocide, but they were catalyzed by harrowing and increasing violence stemming from Muslim nations. So, although the metaphor kind of works, it seems provocative to say the least to suggest that modern Muslims should have to keep 1,000-year-old barbarism in mind for attacks they have no responsibility for. More worryingly still, it's just an extreme form of retaliation, and in particular an extreme Christian form of retaliation. This is put plainly as the last few pages of the issue turn to vengeance, with the stark warning, "You wanted to send a message, and in doing so you awakened us from our self-involvement. Message received. Look for your reply in the thunder." The overall feel of the text is undeniably nationalistic. I counted 32 American flags in the issue, for example. The last couple of pages speak in the second person, we, where we means we Americans. Throughout the issue, great emphasis is put on the heroism of the American citizen, not just Captain America's old-school heroic masculinity, but everyday heroism, with a direct call to the reader, the assumed American reader, that they are the hero. Now, this is relevant for two reasons. One, it begins an enormous trend of our heroes becoming more vulnerable, which we'll get to in a second. Secondly, that the comics seem to be a product designed for an American readership. This is extremely different from films like Captain America Civil War or Guardians of the Galaxy, which are made to have an international appeal. It's a very important distinction because we'll see very differing attitudes from the two mediums when it comes to their responses to 9/11 and military action. If we were to look at that dichotomy from the point of view of national manhood, I would say this: comic books aim to shape American masculinity. American comic book movies export a homogenized version, a product of American masculinity, to the world. And in the cracks between those approaches, we can often see what America may not want the rest of the world to. For example, Wonder Woman, shown here during the War on Terror, demonstrating to a group of Afghani women what Star-Spangled Freedom looks like, literally exporting a caricature of American womanhood to the Middle East. Now, regardless of what you think about religion or objectification or hypersexualization or any of that, this is probably a problem. I may be picking a particularly bad example here, but let's honestly try and visualize that happening in the next Wonder Woman movie. It won't, and hopefully it never will. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. There's a difference between what will be pushed to a predominantly young American male audience and what will be pushed to a diverse international market. And in the Black issue, we see a version of America that is filled with heroes, filled with aircraft carriers, and rooms filled with generals. The underlying message is one of power, an effort to reinvigorate the national manhood that had just been challenged using a medium that had been shaped for it long ago by the Comics Code Authority. A couple more books of note here are Heroes by Marvel, which is close to the Black issue in terms of its subject matter, focusing on heroes and first responders working together. The issue featured many heroes and artists that were not or were no longer part of Marvel, but still all came together to produce a wonderful tribute. Another text deserving of mention is also by Marvel and titled A Minute's Silence. It came out in 2002 and featured a foreword by Mayor Rudy Giuliani, in which he declared, "I think we all now realize that we do not have to read fiction to find examples of heroism. The real heroes in American life have been with us all along. Our firefighters, police officers, and other rescue workers put their lives on the line every day to protect the rest of us from danger." Now again, this, and indeed the entire issue, is done to reinvigorate belief in American heroism, and obviously to pay respect to the brave men and women that were there. But that's part of it too. A hero was needed and one was there. And now comic books are being used to amplify and lionize that hero, that image of national manhood, with the express sign-off of the Mayor of New York. I'm not being conspiratorial here, I'm simply pointing out that these texts and heroes are a wonderful place to build a heroic mythos, be that for Spiderman, the FDNY, or America's belief in itself. It's often a romanticized ideal, but these ideals are what national identities are built on, and in the case of the FDNY, true, real, and fatal heroism. There are many more graphic texts that deal with 9/11 directly, but we're more interested in how these products have been indirectly shaped, and for that we need to look towards cinema. Initially, audiences rejected cinema that was reminiscent of the 9/11 attacks. For example, The Sum of All Fears, which was filmed prior to the event, touched similar ground and left audiences extremely unimpressed. The War of the Worlds also showed citywide destruction on American landmarks and was equally considered a flop. There was a certain amount of time where any media was considered in extremely bad taste. It's a subject that had to be approached carefully. But I think Cloverfield and Iron Man really were the breakthrough titles that started putting similar imagery out and really acknowledging that the event happened on screen in something other than documentary or memorial or biopic. Bonnie Mann said that there is something both grotesque and comic, frightening and adolescent about images of manhood that circulate when an inflated fantasy of masculine invulnerability is at stake in the life of the nation. Suggesting that as our sense of invincibility and social safety has inflated, so too have our heroes. Our view of maleness and national manhood becomes more certain and less adult, more in fact like boyish fantasy as we become more certain of our dominant position. That is to say that our idealized bodybuilder images, superheroes, and certainty of American invulnerability were all becoming more and more cartoonish and hyper-real. Not only then does it make sense that comic books and superheroes would be a place we'd look to in times of heroic crisis, but more so does it make sense when we remember action figures such as Arnold Schwarzenegger and other explosion-riding, invincible action heroes of 80s and 90s cinema. Action heroes then could take shots to the shoulder like they were paintballs, they could fall from any height, and were seemingly immune from infection. But then this perceived immortality of the American hero comes crashing down with the 9/11 attacks. And looking back, it seems like the change happened almost overnight, but in reality it was in the few years following 2001. Action heroes started becoming a lot more vulnerable. If you look at the difference between Die Another Day and Casino Royale, Die Another Day was reviewed very poorly and featured a near invincible, for literally no reason, Englishman in his late 40s, and it came out shortly after 9/11, and it seemed clear that fans were growing weary of such depictions. Casino Royale, on the other hand, was critically acclaimed and focused much more heavily on delivering a more realistic and smaller scale Bond adventure, a Bond that experienced trauma, a Bond that was human. Obviously Bond isn't American, I just love talking about Casino Royale, but the trend can be seen across action cinema, and it's especially easy to recognise when you consider how our heroes, specifically our action heroes, are portrayed on screen today as opposed to the 80s or 90s. They're more vulnerable, hits land and damage sticks. Sure, we'll still have the hyper-stylized Hollywood violence and plenty of damage that shouldn't be possible, but overall it's a much realer experience. Most importantly, characters are no longer immune to trauma, they're defined by it, and this is a major cause of the rising popularity of superhero movies. Owen Horton suggests several factors contributed to the rise of the superhero film: cheaper and higher quality CGI technology, cultural embrace of the nerd lifestyle, acquisition and consolidation of licensing rights, and successful bets on quality filmmakers in Christopher Nolan and Jon Favreau. But he also makes the case for an additional factor, a zeitgeist emerging out of 9/11 and the War on Terror perfectly fit for the superhero narrative template. Superhero films after 9/11 told the stories of heroes born out of trauma, murdered parents, terrorist attacks, exploded homeworlds, battling villains who resisted identification and embraced the shadows. These characters' stories are defined by their trauma. More importantly, for the most part, that trauma is the instigator for them to build themselves into something superhuman, something heroic. Iron Man is injured and captured, and from this adversity becomes the hero that we follow. Captain America, Doctor Strange, the Hulk, Batman, this resonates extremely well with an audience that is rebuilding itself from trauma. The traumatic origin story resonates because it reflects a shift in national consciousness following 9/11. The illusions of invulnerability and safety were shattered, and in the aftermath, nationalist rhetoric reconfigured itself around concepts of resolve, revenge, and steadfastness. Thus, just as Bruce Wayne and Tony Stark find themselves forever changed by their trauma, so was the American national mythos rebooted to reflect a strength of character in surviving trauma. It's often referred to as artificial masculinity. American masculinity has been perceived to have failed, so it's time to build up something new, something more powerful, just like these characters do. They represent the ethos of the American national psyche following 2001, broken but ready to rise again. Symbols of American heroism that would reinvigorate national manhood. I'm not actually sure Iron Man would succeed again in today's climate. Robert Downey Jr.'s immense charisma notwithstanding, fans were pretty clear on not wanting another billionaire superhero with their response to Iron Fist. But as it so happened, Tony Stark re-exploded into public awareness at just the right time. The billionaire ultra-capitalist from inherited wealth, standing in the middle of a desert in war-torn Afghanistan, displaying the power of American military ingenuity in the middle of the War on Terror. It's a powerful image, and RDJ is having so much fun doing it that you can't help but find it thrilling. The decision to switch the threat from an Asian enemy, as it was in the comic books, to Afghanistan is deliberately political. Not only does it firmly place the MCU in the real world, it also positions our superheroes firmly on the side of America. It's nationalistic, and seeing as the War on Terror and Afghanistan aren't mentioned again in any other movies, or dwelled upon like Sokovia is, for example, it seems like off-camera Tony may have essentially ended the War on Terror. The film begins with Tony in a Humvee ride-along, surrounded by soldiers that idolize him prior to undergoing an ambush on his convoy. Houghton suggests that the ensuing chaos in the aftermath of an RPG attack gives spectacle to a concept Americans were familiar with at the time, the terrifying unpredictability of the improvised explosive device. Prior to the attack, Tony had felt safe, carefree, a participant of Cavedon's Invincibility myth. Tony, like Americans prior to the 9/11 attacks, perceived himself safe from foreign attack. Whether by wealth, power, location, or simply arrogance, Stark ascribes to these same myths about himself, just as America did. Tony is kidnapped, and the final scene before the film's timeline flashes back is a hostage video. Again, a scene extremely reminiscent of what was showing on American news at the time. Masked men with guns in a bunker or cave setting, forcing a single speaker to read out a prepared statement. To Houghton, Tony's abduction parallels Bruce's fall into the Batcave. It's Joe Chill shooting Thomas and Martha Wayne. It's the Twin Towers coming down live on television. Like Bruce's story, Tony's trauma functions as a prerequisite for his training and ascension. This is amplified by Favreau's decision to move the film back 36 hours to highlight Tony's innocence. The film asks us to be critical of Tony's wealth and focuses on him shirking responsibilities, sleeping with multiple women, treating friends like servants, and convincing them to shirk their responsibilities too. He is arrogant and foolish, and Favreau wants us to recognize this. The Ten Rings, the vague and mysterious terrorist group that kidnapped Tony, are undoubtedly reminiscent of Al-Qaeda, and purposefully so. They also happen to be unfit arbiters of judgment, and instead it falls to Tony to stand in judgment of himself. As previously mentioned, while Tony may have had supreme American military power on his side, during his moment of trauma, the attack on his convoy and his subsequent kidnapping, he has access to none of this. He is broken, unable to prevent what his attackers have done. An icon of Americanism brought to its knees by the Afghani threat. The subtext isn't very closely masked here. But what does he do next? Well, he reinvents himself. As I mentioned earlier, this is artificial masculinity. He literally creates another man, Iron Man, to destroy the enemies he could not. This motivation actually escalates in Stark, with him later wanting to put a suit of armor around the world. His desire is to become something impervious to attack due to the trauma of him being attacked. Then, without any kind of jurisdiction or elective process, he simply starts acting like the police of the world, operating without checks or balances. It's interesting because there's clearly a narrative of anti-war sentiment at work here. By 2005, when the film's release, there was heated division on the justifications for war, and the film isn't entirely ignorant of that. Once Stark realizes his weapons are being used by terrorists, he flies around destroying both the weapons and the terrorists. This does seem like a corrective action, given that America has been the catalyst for many of these terrorist cells. Before Tony leaves for Afghanistan, he is criticized by a reporter for war profiteering, and his family's continuing benefit from American military intervention abroad. He cites his father in his reply, suggesting that peace means having a bigger stick than the other guy. Tony is extremely assured in the size of his stick at the start of the movie. After the traumatic events of his kidnapping, though, it's as much about re-establishing Tony's stick as dominant as it is about war or peace. His trauma relates directly to his masculinity, and his manhood is closely linked with that of America here, so it's pretty easy to see how Tony's corrective vengeance is concerned with restoring American manhood as well as his own. The stick measuring contest is remarkably one-sided against the terrorists. Once Tony returns to Afghanistan with his Mark II armor, he drops in on the terrorists that had held him hostage. They're now occupying a village and, again, holding the residents at gunpoint. He stands in front of them proudly, long enough to display he is completely impervious to their bullets, and then punches one of his attackers through a wall. This is the American man rebuilt, the invincibility myth reified in a suit of armor. From here, he is quick to demonstrate his stick as much larger than any of his Afghani opponents, and he will only be challenged in this respect when facing down an American opponent of equal wealth, status, and power. Ultimately, upon realizing exactly how his weapons have ended up in the hands of the terrorists, essentially by backroom deals from an American manufacturer, in clear mirroring of American guilt over trading weapons with Osama bin Laden prior to 9/11 and many other groups, Tony roots out the evil in the capitalist system, the Obadiah stain on the good name of capitalism. This is a symbolically corrective action. Now Tony's billionaire capitalist arms dealer status is redeemed morally, and the audience is free to have fun with it. Iron Man's villains are businessmen, inventors, and war profiteers. To Houghton, the Iron Man trilogy reflects shifting anxieties about the war on terror, anxieties about where all our action has gotten us, anxieties about finally getting to the core of terrorism and finding ourselves at the root. This can all be seen as redemptive of the American capitalist persona. Him getting rid of his armaments from around the world and removing corrupt elements from the American system is fantasy fulfillment. But it allows the audience to get on side with someone who began the movie being directly representative of Western military intervention. The movie ends with the phrase, "I am Iron Man," this time played as a reveal rather than a battle cry. While this moment was undeniably awesome, it also reproblematizes Tony as an unelected form of world police destroying who he sees fit with highly advanced weaponry. It pretty much undoes most of the work he put into getting rid of his illegally traded weapons. He's still creating enough weapons to cause global catastrophe, but now it's only him choosing when to pull the trigger. RDJ's undeniable charisma is vital in selling to the audience what is essentially a candy-red rebranding of American military intervention and the unchecked excise of the military-industrial complex. He seems cheerily ignorant to the lives he's taken and faces the world with no apologies. In a recent interview, the Russo brothers described this line as the defining moment of the MCU. It set the tone for what these films were going to be, the most major point being that the MCU would forgo the traditional notion of secret identities, something that superhero movies have been obsessed with up until this point. Iron Man doesn't want to operate in secret. He operates in the open, on the side of good. This kind of brash self-justification is ubiquitously associated with American foreign policy, and while this may seem like I'm going a little off the deep end here, do remember that Iron Man's best friend is a high-up military officer, and he is seemingly the only person Tony is willing to share his tech with. Although Tony may not have given it to him willingly at first, he does eventually provide Rhodey with the War Machine 2.0 armor as a sign of his willingness to share the tech with elements of the government he trusts. It's a far cry from killing people in foreign countries because they even dared to stockpile your weapons, and demonstrates the inherent American bias to Tony's actions. The name Rhodey chooses for himself is War Machine, a literal synonym for the American military-industrial complex. Of course, this isn't coincidental, and has long been what Rhodey's represented in the comic books. Patriotism, nationalism, the defense of America. During Iron Man 3, he's even rebranded as the Iron Patriot. This relationship seems to morally legitimize both parties. Tony now sharing his tech with the American government provides the morality, the judgment we trust and we've seen him display. We know Tony will do what's right. The American government provides legal legitimacy. Tony is still kind of operating outside of them, but now we understand he's officially aligned with the good guys in at least some sense. Neither should really be operating as they do, and yet this relationship seems to let both parties justify each other. In doing so, not only has American national manhood been redeemed through Tony's victory, but America is demonstrated to be definitely the good guys by rooting out the bad seeds such as Obadiah Stane. Both America and American heroism are reinvigorated, and we're left happy in the fact that Tony has cheerily announced his intention to police the world. So whether it's changing Tony's origins to a more Middle Eastern orientation or long-standing character traits like we see with Rhodey, this movie undoubtedly presents a cleaned up and morally acceptable version of the hyper-capitalist warmonger that's in bed with the American government and at the same time performing illegal operations around the world. An extremely likable persona that ultimately does aim to get the audience on board with his questionable actions. A persona that puts a likable face on capitalism and Western intervention, 3 years into the War on Terror, in a movie that will kickstart one of the biggest American cultural exports of all time. And it's not like most of it is even left to subtext once we consider the MCU as a whole. This becomes a major plot point during Avengers 2 and especially Civil War. There is one other major point of relevance in the Iron Man saga which I've deliberately ignored up until now due to its increased relevance in the later two movies. That is the idea of Iron Man as a sanitized version of drone warfare. Tony is linked with his suit in a way other heroes are not. Man and machine are joined literally. The power source is built into the chest, and Tony Stark and Iron Man are indistinguishable from one another, unlike Bruce Wayne and Batman. The Iron Man trilogy reimagines masculinity through advanced technology. This comes at a time where drone warfare was being pushed first by the Bush administration, and then perhaps even harder by the Obama administration. It was emphasized as safe, or at least a safer alternative to dead soldiers on the ground. A new kind of warfare that put the preservation of American lives first, but ultimately has been proven to be nowhere near as careful in its distinction between hostile and civilian. Stark seeks to stop warfare before it begins, a preventative force through an ultimate threat. The illusions are pretty clear here, and become even more so during the events of Iron Man 2, Avengers 2 and Iron Man 3, as Tony begins building fleets of autonomous flying suits, a force of drones policing the world, even literally providing a suit of armor to the President of the United States of America. This is obviously a fantastical representation of drone warfare, which is highlighted beautifully during the previously mentioned village scene in Iron Man 1. As Stark assesses the threats around him, we're shown the heads-up display from inside his visor. Miraculously, his onboard AI immediately identifies civilians and hostiles, and a rapidly deployed shoulder-mounted weapon system immediately kills the hostiles with zero harm to any of the hostages. Just like America, Tony is fighting a vague and difficult to distinguish guerrilla enemy, and Tony and subsequently drones are demonstrated to be almost magical in their precision. Perfect weapons that leave the innocent completely unharmed, like they're fit with an onboard terrorism detector. Like America, Tony's primary goal here is safety. Drones were extremely helpful, at first at least, in garnering support for extended warfare. While Americans were thirsty for revenge following 9/11, they were not keen on the idea of the further loss of American lives. Again, what we see here is fantasy fulfillment, and a reminder that this new form of warfare has once again rendered America invulnerable. Perhaps the most egregious fantasy fulfillment at work here, though, is the innocent's reaction to Tony's interventions. One of the hostages, a young boy, is reunited with his father. As Iron Man walks by him, he looks at him with gratitude. He's happy about Iron Man's intervention. It's an odd moment, as the film seems to suggest that drone intervention is welcomed by those it supposedly saves. As has become very clear since, this is simply a fantasy. Fallout from drone strikes has been catastrophic, and Western intervention in the Middle East has been largely unwelcomed. It's fair to say, though, that Iron Man 2 does present a much less favourable view of the American military, one that will become far more prominent during Captain America Civil War, that of the power-hungry tyrant. They want to seize control, or replicate, if possible, the Iron Man technology with the help of Justin Hammer. But just as we see with Obadiah Stane, Justin Hammer is simply a corrupt parallel to Tony, through which Tony can again redeem the profile of the military-industrial complex. Hammer is a fool, and cannot do the things Tony can do. He's a secondary masculinity designed for the audience to find ridiculous. He's not presented seriously like the generals in Iron Man 1, or the rooms full of commanders flanked by eagles as seen in the Black issue. Both Tony's enemies in this movie are inventors and engineers. They just don't do it as well as Tony. They don't have Tony's morals either. And it brings home the message that the weapon is only as good as the person using it. Now this is again redemptive fantasy. No matter how well you fly the drone, if you shoot it into a population center, then innocent people will be harmed. It pushes the notion that there is such a thing as the correct way to use weaponry on a large scale, which of course there isn't. Once Tony roots out the corrupt seed in Justin Hammer, the machine is redeemed once more. Tony's back in control of America, so nobody panic. And he even says as much. It's working, we're safe, America is secure. You want my property, you can't have it, but I did you a big favor, I've successfully privatized world peace. Now there's a lot going on here. Firstly, he's essentially speaking as America. We're safe, America is secure. He's assumed so much power that he can apparently speak for the security of the entire nation. Also, he's undeniably aligning with America still. He's not going against them, as we see Cap do later. The notion of his rights to his property is again undeniably American, as is the notion of privatizing a concept, especially when that concept is world peace. So yeah, the scene may paint America as power-hungry and greedy, but it also quickly redeems that with a pretty genius act of transference, in which from this point on, Tony Stark simply becomes representative of the American government. Disney largely replaced American higher-ups just with Tony wherever possible, and now the audience has an America they can trust, outside of real-world anxieties regarding government and military. Like he says, he's simply privatized the whole thing under the Stark brand. Lastly, and most importantly, this is a continuation of I Am Iron Man in its meaning. He's doubling down on his, again highly American, status as unregulated world police, and Hammer's failure and the government's greed for the control of the weaponry provide all the tacit justification for this Tony needs going forward. It may seem, as again we'll see with Cap later on, that some sort of change has occurred, but it's not really changed so much as sanitation. The audience can now rest assured knowing the American government has been cleaned up and is on their side again. Throughout his narratives, Tony ultimately overcomes villains through technological advancement, his true superpower being the ability to always improvise, adapt, and overcome his enemy. Since the trauma of his kidnapping, the motivation has always been safety. However, during the ending events of Avengers 1 and the starting events of Avengers 2, Tony is shown a new kind of enemy, one that can move independent of time and space, armies that teleport from worlds away, unknowable threats. Tony is made crushingly aware that a single suit of armor will not be enough to protect the world, and it is this fear that propels him towards his larger efforts. From soldier in armor to drone operator overseeing multiple missions from the safety of home. He still aims to beat whatever threat may come with technology, just on a much larger scale. Not until Iron Man 3 does he try a different approach. Again, the film presents a vague, terroristic threat that is again a guise for Western business interests. This time, however, Tony must overcome Killian by finally coming to terms with his trauma and his identity. The Iron Man 3 trailer starts with the quote, "Nothing's been the same since New York. I can't sleep, and when I do, I have nightmares." To succeed here, he must finally overcome the conflict that catalyzed him, here described simply as New York. Now, in a literal sense, that refers to the events of Avengers 1 and the Battle of New York. But obviously, when considering everything we've discussed here and the roots of Tony's trauma, there's an obvious double meaning going on. Tony must come to terms with his fictional trauma, as America uses fictional trauma to overcome their actual trauma through Tony. Ultimately, he decides that his life with Pepper is what's most important to him, and he makes the decision to retire his Iron Man suits. This also comes alongside his decision to finally become accountable to American and even world government. We'll look at that in more detail, but let's leave Tony for now and move on to Captain America. We're going to look at Captain America slightly differently. As with Tony, his character undergoes serious shifts, but with Captain America, we seem to have two very different characters before and after the events of Winter Soldier. Firstly, we have origin story Captain America, the first Avenger. Here, he is undeniably patriotic, pretty much bleeding red, white, and blue. It's the Cap we see in Spider-Man's Black issue, stoic and unyielding against the greatest evil the planet has ever seen. Not only are Nazis an extremely clear enemy, but they also present a time in which American citizens were extremely assured in their government and their place in the world. Cap is undyingly loyal to America, and that loyalty is never questioned or problematized in this film. It's total war, and Cap is on the side of good, America is on the side of good, and we're back at Bonnie Man's old-school American masculinity, arrogant, simple-minded, and infallible. And that's essentially what Cap is. Not arrogant to an annoying degree, but certainly cocky as he tells his opponent he could do this all day. His bravado is entirely reminiscent of Man's description. Cap's trauma stems not just from the war, or losing Bucky, or the experiments he needed to undergo, but also his initial weakness, his rejection from the fight. He desperately wants to help and to be the hero, as demonstrated early on by his jumping on the grenade. Unfortunately, he literally doesn't fit the bill for national manhood. He's too frail to even be conscripted, and is continually rejected until Erskine finally agrees to let him with the intention of nominating him for the Super Soldier program. Here, an inability to fight for one's country is played as a great deficiency, which for many people it was during times of conscription. However, Steve's interaction with the Super Soldier Serum takes him from someone unable to live up to the image of national manhood to the very epitome of it. And there's an interesting meta relationship Cap enjoys with America here. In the lore of the movie, Steve becomes a celebrity and is used to influence American masculinity and ideas of American heroism overseas. This is of course exactly how the character was used in reality, as a propagandic tool to promote American heroism during World War II. It is in fact part of the reason why the character was created, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby being morally repulsed by the actions of Nazi Germany in the few years preceding World War II. They felt war was inevitable, and this was the mascot they created to champion America through it. Steve's status as someone who is initially unheroic in stature but heroic in morals is again a call to the everyman. Another reinvigoration of heroism into the American psyche, that this could be any of them. And really, truthfully, that's what this film is. While Iron Man may have invited the viewer to be critical of Tony's life choices before getting into the suit, the same cannot be said for Steve. The morality is clear as day. He's an American man that becomes an American hero and fights the most despicable force of evil on the planet. But that's exactly what it's supposed to be, uncomplicated, a time when military action wasn't questioned because of its undeniable necessity. And when you view that in conjunction with everything Iron Man had just done, you start to see an incredibly pro-America MCU starting to form in Phase 1, one perfectly suited for re-establishing the dominance of American national manhood. And that's interesting because while the characters of Tony and Steve are natural opposites, they both fight on the side of good, and they both identify, until Civil War at least, the American government as that side of good. When we first meet Tony, he doesn't want to be handed things and spends his days philandering, whereas Steve will throw himself into gunfire, onto grenades, under barbed wire, before he ever receives any form of power. There's an important distinction between these two characters. One is the American leader, the other is the American soldier, or maybe even just the American. Tony enjoys the benefits of power, whereas Steve feels the impact of the excise of that power. It's an important distinction that is essentially the cause of the character shift in Steve during Winter Soldier. Tony is logical and calculating. He stands for America. Steve is emotional and optimistic and stands for the American people. So while America may have needed a mascot to fight for its interests overseas following 9/11, as we see in Iron Man and the first Avenger, by the time Winter Soldier comes around, the war on terror was slowing down, and attitudes both domestically and internationally had changed dramatically. Steve wouldn't just reflect these attitudes, he'd react with them, as he too uncovered his government were acting as an enemy of the people. Tension had been mounting for some time regarding the ethics and tactics employed during the war on terror. Multiple investigations were launched into the enhanced interrogation techniques of the CIA and other acts of barbarism committed in military prison camps to assumed enemies of the war on terror. Proof of WMDs was never presented, and in England various national inquiries were mired in controversy as the country tried to come to terms with its role in the war. Between 2007 and 2014, when Winter Soldier was released, WikiLeaks published multiple documents that were incredibly problematic to the war on terror's domestic approval. These included, but aren't limited to, handbooks for prisoner treatment at detainment centres, over 400,000 classified documents from the American government regarding the Iraq War, which painted a much darker and more accurate image of Iraqi civilian casualties, video footage of Apache helicopters firing on civilians and journalists that would see Bradley Manning detained and imprisoned. The list was vast and is still ongoing. In 2013, a year before Winter Soldier released, an even more shocking leak from the then NSA analyst Edward Snowden demonstrated that the NSA had the ability to, and actively were spying on the American people at an individual level. He essentially blew the whistle on classified spying programs that provided unparalleled levels of surveillance on the American people. With all this working in unison, belief in the American government had hit an all-time low. While the first Avenger may have been focused on the certainty of America's place as international arbiter, the Winter Soldier is forced to do the opposite. Cap is the champion of the people, and the people were being lied to. The Russo brothers, again speaking in a recent interview, described the betrayal of Cap by his government as the biggest turning point in the MCU, a fulcrum shift between Phase 1 and Phase 2, a move from a highly nationalist pro-America rhetoric to one that was critical of American governance. They wanted to problematize Cap's unwavering faith in government and patriotism. They sought a way to deconstruct and reinvigorate the character, and they took themes from the contemporary culture, which is exactly what this video is about. In fact, they even described this shift as a move from soldier to insurgent, which I think fits pretty perfectly with what we're discussing here, and provides unusual empathy to a term we'd usually recognize as designating terroristic enemies of the state. Subsequently, the Winter Soldier's main plot is concerned with enemies within the American government, and more specifically S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, although S.H.I.E.L.D. and Hydra are both supposedly international agencies, this really isn't the case in practicality. Both have clear racial signifiers. S.H.I.E.L.D. seems to be staffed by Americans with inexorable ties to the American government. Hydra are the opposite, usually sounding vaguely non-English when speaking freely. Although they do certainly have American members, they're more often than not just portrayed as vaguely foreign. Anything from full Nazi to just slightly Eastern Bloc, and it's likely someone affiliated with Hydra. This less than subtly again positions America as the side of good and the just, while casually demonizing those that aren't American. In fact, it often verges on Orientalism, a term usually applied to disparaging attitudes towards non-Western, traditionally Eastern and Asian nationalities. Obviously, the name suggests this is specific to that demographic, but it's just as commonly referring to negative attitudes towards the Middle East and even areas such as Afghanistan or Far Eastern Europe like the fictional Sokovia. This trend seems relatively certain. Almost every good guy and girl speaks with an American accent. Tony, Cap, Bruce, Hawkeye, Doctor Strange, Spiderman, the list goes on and on. And sure, they're all American characters, but what about Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow? Yes, she's a super spy that can talk in many accents, but her natural accent in the comics is traditionally a Russian one. It's a major part of the character. Yet our entire experience with her here is on the side of good, the side of S.H.I.E.L.D., the side of America. The only time her loyalty is ever in question is when she stands against world government on the side of Captain America. The only real indicators we have of her being Russian are her second name and a vague Whedon flashback. If we compare that to villains, we quickly see an opposite story: German, Russian, Sokovian, Afghani, etc. Again, sure, a lot of these are character origins that stem from a long time ago, and there are plenty of American villains too, but we do have a pattern for the most part of the good guys looking and sounding like one thing, and the bad guys looking and sounding like another. Now, I'm certainly not accusing the MCU of xenophobia or anything silly like that, but it's an important point when considering how the franchise constructs America as innately on the side of good. Now, there are two major exceptions to this rule in Wanda and Pietro Maximoff. Both speak with thick Sokovian accents and ultimately end up on the side of good. With that being said, though, they do start as villains hell-bent on destroying Tony Stark and the Avengers, and only one of them makes it out of Avengers 2 alive. The remaining one could well still have a much darker moment ahead of her in the form of No More Mutants. I think it's fair to say they're kind of representative of the immigrant or refugee narrative, but we'll look at that in more depth when we get to Avengers 2. So while S.H.I.E.L.D. is the enemy in the Winter Soldier and subsequently the American government, it's not really. It's still Hydra that's infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. The good guys still have American accents at the end, and the bad guys are still vaguely foreign. Like Tony, Steve merely had to root out the corrupted Americans, and he could return the institutions back to normal. While the movie starts out critical of American government and portrays them throughout as infested with warmongers and people that have no care for their own populace, Steve's actions are ultimately redemptive. As with the end of Iron Man 1, the bad root has been dug out and the audience is free to love America again. The corrupted governmental institutions redeemed and reclaimed for the people by an icon of national manhood. Again, this comes at a time when this is exactly what the American public needed, and it shows in how well received the film was. It is of course fantasy fulfillment again. No such change of hands or acts of justice occurred in the real world. Although the film ends with S.H.I.E.L.D. and the American government redeemed to the audience and free from corruption, it leaves Steve now standing somewhat apart from the American government heading into civil war. As the Russos have stated, Cap was fundamentally changed as a character when he stepped out of that elevator. And that says a lot, that to the filmmakers Cap has lost his love for America. But remember, he's the soldier, not the general. He may not love, or more importantly, trust the American government anymore, but Cap will be the first one to tell you that the government isn't what America is. It's the place, the people, the spirit. That's the America he fights for. And make no bones about it though, he has no trust left for American authority. And that says a lot about public opinion, Captain America as an icon, and notions of national manhood. Cap here is almost representing the rallying cry of pro-gun camps when they remind critics that the guns protect them from the tyranny of governmental evil. Regardless of what you think about guns, that ideal is undeniably American and has been regaining popularity heavily throughout the Obama and Trump administrations. It's also worth noting that the ultimate plan of the bad guys here is population control through mass extinction events, carried out by what are dubbed as helicarriers, but essentially are megadrones. There's quadcopter blades reminiscent of domestic drone craft, and the automated and remote killing functions from these gyroscopically stabilized floating arms platforms bear enough similarities that I think we could comfortably call this thing a megadrone. And as we've covered, but especially when this movie came out, criticism of drone strikes was at the forefront of international concern. Not entirely, but mostly, conspiratorial theories regarding America attacking or staging attacks on their own populace also became much more widespread. And so we have an enemy that is in many ways the sum of conspiratorial fears and worse criticisms of American military control. And Cap, our American icon of national manhood rallying against government tyranny, is here to rebalance the scales. Before we head to Civil War though, let's check out Avengers 1 and 2, starting with the catharsis of citywide destruction. I would assume that most of you are very familiar with scenes such as this, or this, or this, or this, or this. There is an undeniable trend of just put a city in danger from a big energy thing in the sky in the third act of modern action movies. The big energy thingy is usually vague in nature and not really very well explained other than its ability to destroy. As we've seen with so much of the content here, this is largely fantasy fulfillment and the exercise of post-9/11 anxieties. The vagueness of the threat is important, perhaps because whatever the threat is genuinely unimportant. What matters is that it's a threat to population centers, nearly always metropolitan American population centers. And one point that we haven't touched on in detail so far, but has been prevalent throughout this discussion, is that idea of intangibility and vagueness. The War on Terror, 9/11, Afghanistan, America was at war with a decentralized enemy, one that couldn't really be pinned down or beaten in a traditional sense, one that didn't wear a uniform. Kind of like Hydra, you cut off a head and two more take their place. We have this vagueness to our villains throughout the MCU. Ten Rings, the Mandarin, Hydra, Ultron to a certain extent could apply here in that he was an intangible mass that moved between various shells. Even Thanos, as established as he is now, began his MCU career with audiences asking, "Who's the big purple dude on the space throne?" This vagueness applies very much here too. The destruction of cities across the third act is vague not just because it's a threat to population centres, but because it's reflective of America's military opposition throughout the War on Terror, almost undefinable yet undeniably existent and destructive. So I'm going to talk specifically for the most part here about the ending events of Avengers 1, but you should understand a lot of what I'm about to say as being extremely widespread in post 9/11 cinema. Without doubt, we see a fetish for citywide destruction, specifically the partial destruction but eventual salvation of American cities. This battle during Avengers Assemble is perhaps somewhat of a subconscious landmark to superhero movies, removing superheroes from their role as heroic preventers of evil and into the role of first responders, in clear mimicry of America's shift in what it deemed heroic in American national manhood. The first responders of 9/11 were the heroes, and here, really for the first time, we see our superheroes acting as such on screen. This is reminiscent of a couple of the books we looked at earlier that dealt directly with the 9/11 attacks, namely Marvel Heroes and A Moment of Silence, where emphasis is put on the heroism of responding to disaster rather than preventing it. This would become a recurrent theme. The start of Batman v Superman is a notable example, with Bruce simply responding to the chaos caused by Zod's battle with Superman. This is the sort of disaster Batman traditionally averts, yet post-Avengers, and more importantly, post 9/11, we're a lot more concerned with fallout. The threat here is an unpredicted assault stemming from a portal or a wormhole created above New York City, led by Loki but comprised of a Chitauri army that we would later learn fought for Thanos. So immediately we have a surprise attack on New York from the air, centered around its skyline, from a foreign or alien threat that was previously unannounced. A group of foes hell-bent on destruction, following a shadowy and charismatic leader. We could even go one step further and say that this attack occurred through the hijacking of American technology, the Tesseract being experimented on by S.H.I.E.L.D. prior to Loki's usurping of it. While this situation, location, and threat may all be reminiscent of 9/11, the following events are better described as bloodless, corrective fantasy. The Chitauri swarm New York and seem to be aiming to kill indiscriminately, yet we never see them succeed on screen. Through extended universe stuff though, we do learn that the body count between civilians and police is 74, with a staggering $88 billion worth of property damage to New York City. Inclusive of the attacks on the Pentagon, the property damage from 9/11 is estimated to be around $100 billion, with 3,000 people dead. So this is a tremendously ineffective attack, considering the motivation of the Chitauri seems to be largely genocidal. We still see destruction on the same scale, just almost entirely without casualties. Of course, this ineffectuality is due almost entirely to the superiority of our heroes. Hawkeye, who is just a human, one American man on a rooftop in New York, can seemingly dispatch as many Chitauri as he has arrows with perfect accuracy. Iron Man is essentially a child in a toy box here, using all the advancements at his disposal to destroy the Chitauri groups at a time. Hulk can dispatch the largest of the Chitauri units with a single punch. While this remains one of my favourite battle scenes, the threat never really seems prescient as it may do during Helm's Deep or Battle of the Bastards. This is obviously in part due to this being a much lighter toned Disney product, but at the same time it's no doubt corrective fantasy for 9/11, how 9/11 could have gone had America had the preparedness or moments longer to respond. It's a demonstration of a city being protected by its national manhood in an effort to reinvigorate it. Towards the end of the battle, government forces launch a nuclear warhead towards New York. Tony redirects the warhead through the portal and into the Chitauri fleet, who simply watch impotently as the power of American technology dismantles them in their entirety. Tony, wrapped in the further safety of American technology, falls back through the portal and away from the blast. So it's not really bloodless, is it? The film ends with a tone of calm, the day has been saved, but Tony just killed at least thousands of sentient beings and is nonchalant enough to ask everyone if they want to go get shawarma. Now, I'm not a Chitauri sympathizer here, they are essentially hellspawn, but it's the casual nature in which mega-violence is conducted by governments and American heroes and can still be treated as a point of comedy that is worth noting. When any amount of American lives are in danger, such as Cap stopping the bomb and saving civilian lives, the situation is treated as dramatic, crucial, and emotional. Nuking an entire army is treated at first as an awesome explosion, and then secondly a respite, a point to make jokes. Guilt would imply the humanity of the enemy, and so America makes sure to remain guiltless. So while I said a few moments ago that we're much more concerned with fallout, I think that concern with fallout is very much American, or rather Western fallout. There is very little thought given to any of the vaguely foreign enemies, and it's easy not to, because they're vague, alien, and mostly portrayed as mindless evils. But whichever way you slice that, it's heavily reminiscent of American and Western attitudes towards foreign enemies in reality. There is a disconnect, though, between the levity and bravado in the films and the depiction of the aftermath of this battle on Marvel Netflix. While the 9/11 trauma in Avengers 1 is clear through subtext, in the civilian survivors of it on Marvel Netflix, we see a much grittier fallout, and a much more obvious metaphor for the Battle of New York as 9/11. Without the context of knowing about the battle, one could be forgiven for assuming Karen Page and the headlines that adorn her editor's wall were in reference to 9/11. Good subtext and dramatic tension often rely on capturing cultural anxieties, for example, Alien and the loss of natural sexuality, Predator and the fear of a dominant racial other, Dracula and European immigration, and so on. When we think of traumatic moments and cultural concerns in the early 2000s, then terrorism is essentially ubiquitous, with 9/11 being the tableau of violence that catalyzed the whole thing. And what platform was this tableau demonstrated through? Well, unless you were in New York, you consumed the events of 9/11 through the media. In fact, Faludi, Mann, and Frecro all agree, as do many others, that this media saturation was responsible for heightening the trauma considerably. Horton suggests that what Americans shared then was both a trauma through media and a trauma from media. The act of watching and rewatching the attacks was enough to cause post-traumatic stress symptoms in people who lived thousands of miles away. It makes sense then that if this trauma had occurred through media, then restorative or corrective media, like we see here, in which the threat to New York is pacified, can be useful in healing that trauma. Superhero movies and destruction like this provide a way of dealing with the tragedy through fiction. Jordan Hoffman describes this as if Marvel was taking back the iconography of New York's destruction, from both the terrorists and real life. As you get further removed from the tragedy, these films become more morally complex, which is why Avengers 1 can simply show our heroes saving New York from the disaster, but the black issue of Spiderman had to show them simply responding to it alongside EMTs. It's why Captain America Winter Soldier can paint the American government as evil, but the first Avenger showed them as unwavering good. We can problematize things more the further we get away from the catastrophe. So I don't want to dwell on Avengers 2 for too long. It does kind of really cement the differing positions of Tony and Steve, but we'll look at that more during Civil War. If you've been following up to this point, I'm sure a lot of this will be starting to spell itself out to you. Tony's increasing and inherently American desire to protect the world through superior armament and increasing utilization of the drone army is indicative of America's real-world push towards so-called safer warfare, where safer very much only applies to the perpetrator. As with Avengers 1, even more so in fact, we're given bloodless citywide destruction, with the Avengers completing the impossible task of evacuating every civilian and preventing the city from meeting complete devastation. This works in conjunction with the ideas we looked at during Iron Man of this kind of fantastical idea of Western intervention. The Sokovian government are really nowhere to be seen, and everyone is extremely grateful for the help given to them by the Western superheroes. There is a notable exception to this though in the form of Wanda and Pietro. Their lives were torn apart by Stark weaponry. Although not deployed by Stark, they were his company's armaments. This is clearly reminiscent of so much of the collateral damage throughout the War on Terror, as with the distrust of the American government in Winter Soldier, or illegal arms trading and war profiteering in Iron Man. We see the MCU work as a redemptive force for America here. The Avengers may be partly responsible for much of Wanda and Pietro's plight, Tony certainly is, but they also provide the route to their new life. Again, we see a form of fantasy fulfillment as the Avengers fly to the source of the calamity they help cause and navigate the catastrophe with almost zero casualties. It's a shockingly bloodless and sterilized representation of military intervention on foreign soil, with drones providing the safety. While Pietro's death is reasonably violent, he is firmly a part of the conflict rather than collateral damage, and it is perhaps the only genuine death in the entire battle. Wanda is ultimately accepted as one of the Avengers, and with their victory over Ultron keeping Sokovia and the world safe, we see another problematic part of the War on Terror, our treatment of those that are the victims of fallout, those that seek asylum or refuge, those that have been overlooked or even harmed because of our actions. It gets redeemed, again in fantasy, with the acceptance of Wanda. Their treatment at the hands of Hydra means much of this hatred stems from brainwashing as well. They have been cultivated to hate America, Tony, and so on, but once they are met with American heroism, they are quick to change sides. Their argument of destabilization due to American military intervention is completely nullified as they recognize the infallible moral center of American heroism. Wanda and Pietro's refugee narrative is a token gesture, and fleeting for the most part, as with the introduction of Zemo, we're given a very different narrative of Sokovian revenge, one that is unflinching in its resolve to destroy our symbols of American manhood, another terrorist. This is again a repetition of not only the vague and terroristic antagonist, but also what we saw in Marvel Netflix following the Battle of New York, an effort to rewrite a worse Fallout so we can include more narratives of trauma. When we see the Sokovia catastrophe play out, you would think there were no civilian casualties at all. Zemo's narrative again provides a story rooted in trauma and fallout of American military intervention. This revolving door relationship, Stark weapons destabilize Sokovia, catalyze Wanda and Pietro, their actions and the subsequent battle that happens in Sokovia all stem from that, and then we have Zemo being destabilized due to the ending events of Avengers 2. It's a revolving door of destabilization through military intervention. This is of course reminiscent of American actions in the Middle East and indeed all over the world, and sets the stage for the Sokovia Accords and Marvel's Civil War, an enormous turning point for the franchise. Civil War marks potentially the most definite shift in the MCU, ending with the decision to begin leaving most of what I'm talking about behind by pushing the growing dichotomy between Cap and Tony into full-scale conflict so that ultimately it can be left behind during Infinity War and Endgame. Tony by this point has decided to side firmly with America and world government. He has abandoned the guise of working independently and is willing to become an agent of a higher power, a cog in a grander machine. Cap resists this, on the other hand, afraid that corrupt governments could force him to commit unjust actions. Although the story doesn't resemble the comic very closely, it's worth pointing out that the original and very popular comic book Civil War was influenced almost entirely by 9/11 and the atmosphere in New York where their offices are based following the attack. To quote them directly, much of the public debate around that time was, how much of your civil liberties are you willing to give up for your security? And I think that core message certainly does transfer to the movie that we're discussing here. In line with the problematization of the American government at work within the film, the movie starts with civilian casualties on foreign soil. The American soldiers, Cap, Falcon, and let's say Nat for the sake of accent, all fail to properly coordinate the powerful weapon they have brought with them, the weapon of course being Scarlet Witch. Her inexperience arguably causes the deaths of 26 people in a nearby building. In keeping with reality, said soil is that of Lagos, Nigeria. It's more typical for military intervention to occur in third world countries because of the relative instability in the area and the lack of a centralized defensive military. The attacker, Crossbones, is undeniably a terrorist, blows himself up in a suicide bombing. There's very clear parallels at work here. It's also worth contrasting the terrified and harrowed reactions of the bystanders here in comparison with Iron Man 1's surgical friend or foe drone strike ability. If Scarlet Witch and Tony both represent drone strikes and foreign intervention, then Tony is the American propaganda of what they do, and Scarlet Witch here is the reality. There's certainly more sincere problematization at work here, but it's important that we understand ahead of time exactly what sort of problematizing that is. Because while it's been critical of the American government, and specifically American espionage, it also wants to eventually redeem them, rather than destroying the viewer's trust in them. More importantly, it doesn't want to harm any notions of American heroic masculinity, so a tightrope must be walked here. Crossbones is a double agent. He starts the explosion, not the American side. His turncoat status removes any kind of nationalistic understanding. A turncoat has by nature given up on their country. Cap, Nat, and Falcon are here representing American heroism and do everything they can, yet are in an impossible situation. While it's technically Scarlet Witch's failing, she again doesn't represent American heroic masculinity, so no harm there. So while we get a pretty terrifying rendition of failed military operations in the Third World, we never actually blame the soldier, the boots on the ground. That's not who public sentiment had rallied against. It's the higher-ups, information gatherers and decision makers that this film has a problem with because that's how public opinion had turned. Now it's important to note that while all this works in terms of the subtext on screen, the heroes aren't technically working inside the confines of the American government at this point. In fact, the American government uses this catastrophe in conjunction with Sokovia to try and legislate superheroes, which given the events of Winter Soldier and more importantly the real-world connotations of American control, seems to suggest would lead to them becoming a weapon similar to how War Machine exists. So while the movie may only be critical of American military intervention here through subtext, it's certainly vocal in its assessment of the desires of America and indeed world government, as we saw prominently in Iron Man 2. Civil War plays out the dichotomy I've been describing between Tony and Cap, leader and logical tactician, versus the emotional and idealistic soldier. both representations of American national manhood that are now played in opposition to one another. As we saw with S.H.I.E.L.D. in Winter Soldier, and Stain, Hammer, or just capitalism in general in the Iron Man films, this conflict isn't designed to have a winner. It's designed to reconcile both while forgiving the sins both have committed. Tony is proven to be ultimately accountable, and Steve is restored to an agent of the people. Both symbols of national manhood are legitimized without the other ever really needing to fail. America is unilaterally strong, both soldiers and leaders. No lions led by donkeys here. This is demonstrated with certainty in how the ending fight between Tony, Bucky, and Cap plays out. Here, Cap has to become the cold-blooded tactician that realizes Tony won't stop, so uses backup and insider knowledge to take advantage of Tony's weaknesses, just as Tony has done to all of his previous enemies. On the other hand, Tony understands this conflict has been set up by Zemo, but ignores that and gives the emotional response of, "It doesn't matter, he killed my mom." Here he takes Cap's place as the emotional idealist that will never stop while a wrong remains unrighted. This provides an interesting, if rather an impartial conclusion. Ultimately, Tony's tactical approach is shown to be dominant, and Cap succeeds by destroying his power source. However, as we have with Cap before, we understand very clearly the emotional driving force in Tony and the general inability to forgive the murder of his parents, and for the most part he succeeds in finishing the film as the emotionally driven ideologue. Again, as we see with Stain's removal or the rectification of S.H.I.E.L.D. in Winter Soldier, this is essentially solving both problems while legitimizing both images of national manhood. As we see with Tony's relationship with the American military, both sides also redeem the other. With that being said, we are presented a clear winner in Cap, the American soldier utilizing the tactics of his commanders, ultimately being the overpowering force. I want to talk briefly about how Marvel presents the concept of war. Obviously, that's all we've been looking at in certain respects, but here I mean specifically things they qualify as a war. Here in Civil War, onwards into Infinity War, the War on Terror is shown in Iron Man 1, and even celestial warfare as we see in Asgard and in some elements of the Guardians of the Galaxy series. On that note, let's just say spoilers for Infinity War begin now. I'll save Endgame until the very end of the video. Now, I don't think anyone wants Saving Private Ryan intestines falling out style violence in the middle of their Ant-Man movie. And if we have a battle for New York in Avengers 1, we need to have something larger to go into in the following movies, a war being a scale grander than the battle. And perhaps most importantly, these are the names of the comic books they're based on. But let's stop for a moment and really think about the wars they have presented. Civil War is a fight between roughly 10 people in a seemingly abandoned airport, and a couple of minor scraps between roughly 5 or so people beyond that. Infinity War involves roughly 6 people fighting on the streets of New York, and then a battle of roughly 4,000 to 6,000 people in the fictional Wakanda, and some stuff happening off-planet. That's not a whole lot of war. It's a homogenized, hyper-simplified version of war in which there are clear good guys who are, save for their alien members, almost entirely American. Even said alien members essentially just look and act like people from the West. It's war that for the most part should be fought, and it never seems to have any grey areas. Now, I'm not saying that the American government is telling Disney to sell warfare to children, I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that these films are almost entirely produced in a system that for the most part still upholds the ideals of its ruling classes, and subsequently, in a lot of ways, it represents the ideals of that system. One of those seemingly being that the good guys look and sound American, or Western at the least, and that warfare is okay when the good guys say it is. Again, these films are a huge cultural export, and they tread a very fine line between being critical of governmental superpowers and military intervention, and the undeniable propagandizing of Americans as the justified police of the world. In fact, there's such a big cultural export that Disney are at the point where the government are involved in things like their acquisition of Fox. As a company, Disney are intrinsically American. They have a huge international presence, but that presence is undoubtedly American. Just like you see in the Epcot Center with other nationalities, they like to present a homogenized, soft stereotypical view of American life to the world, a Walt-inspired, nuclear family-esque lifestyle. War doesn't really play into that ideal, but it certainly did in the comic books. In Civil War, for example, the Civil War events span many different books. A sales tactic maybe, but it really did demonstrate the fallout and loss and complication and trauma that war brings with it. Narratives were suddenly being affected by things you may never even have heard of as a reader, as war, actual war, brought chaos with it. This can't really be said of its movie counterpart, which it's an incredible movie, but it doesn't really ever problematize warfare or ever really feel like war. One other major thing of note, unlike the catharsis and simulation of repelling invasions on American population centers like we looked at earlier, war in the MCU is something that happens almost entirely on foreign soil. While perfectly happy to keep replaying the same fantasy of 9/11, being somehow prevented as we see in Avengers 1, warfare is something distant, something extricated from domestic life. When Americans fight a war, they do so on their enemy's ground, or the foreign ground of their allies, but never within the borders of their own invulnerability. War, as a notion, has been one of distance for well over a century of American life. Pearl Harbor withstanding, it's traditionally seen now as something Americans go overseas to do, and while that may simply be a reality, it's certainly reinforced throughout the MCU. Warfare is something that happens in the wilds of Afghanistan, the jungles of Wakanda, and even the sci-fi scapes of planets unknown. When it occurs in New York, it's an incident, an invasion, a sneak attack, and this can't help but feel slightly reminiscent of the disparity and bias the War on Terror was reported with, and indeed the continuing reality of the American political attitudes towards warfare. One person I've largely left out here is Thor. Thor doesn't fit the current symbol of American national manhood. He is essentially invulnerable. Unlike Banner's Hulk, he seemingly has no weakness. He is joyful in battle, sometimes to the point of seeming uncaring, even referring to mortal arguments as petty at one point. He's buffoonish in a way that Superman could never be, because truthfully he doesn't represent America like the other heroes do. He never loses his accent, he's deliberately alien. He's a buffoon, but an incredibly strong, incredibly hard to take down one. He's the opposite of American national manhood post 9/11, broken and needing to be rebuilt as it was. He's too powerful for trauma. We see him joking several times about things that have happened, predominantly with his brother, that would be scarring to anyone else. Whereas Tony's PTSD is dwelled upon, Thor's is largely a point of comedy. He does eventually get his trauma moment though, at the end of Infinity War and the beginning of Endgame through his interactions with Thanos. His push towards the MCU cosmic and general absence from Earth during much of his solo adventures demonstrates he doesn't really have much of a place or bearing in our reality. Post 9/11, the idea of the Superman is as alien to us as the rest of the MCU cosmic. This is a difficulty that faces the actual Superman. However, Supes is a symbol of American heroic masculinity. He's Kryptonian, but he's also that Kansas farm boy, New York journalist, and World War II veteran. This is likely why most of his recent stories on screen have involved him dying and rebuilding from trauma. We just haven't been interested, or rather accepting, of the Superman archetype because it simply wasn't vulnerable enough for our contemporary climate. While we're on the subject, the wider inclusion of the MCU cosmic demonstrates a few things. It is perhaps not surprising that we experience the depths of space through the lens of an American man when seeing it for the first time. Peter Quill, the explorer, the pioneer, he's been in space nearly his entire life, yet he's still undeniably American. Secondly, the trauma in the national psyche is healing, and with it, the need for vulnerable heroes is reduced. Audiences are once again accepting of Drax's ability to survive crashing into a planet through several hundred trees. We're making a return to the more inflated, invulnerable heroes. Captain Marvel, for example, is overwhelmingly powerful. As our fear of vague and shadowy terrorist groups is removed, we also start to move back towards more imagined threats. And for that, America really needs to look to space and the deeper, more fantastical arenas to find credible threats for its heroes. It also signifies the departure from the subject matter of this video, a move away from films about vulnerable American heroism and into something more concerned with the Golden Age-esque apex of humanity and incredible, fantastical violence between essentially immortal super beings. Something better suited for international audiences and a public consciousness that has been able to move past much of the trauma from the last decade. This shift begins in Avengers 2 and continues through Civil War as our heroes distance themselves from nationalistic tendencies like we saw in Phase 1 and Phase 2 films. This was also confirmed by the Russo brothers, who have described a more international and popularist push in the later movie phases. But it's Black Panther, I think, that cements this change by, in many ways, recastrating American power, or more accurately, castrating American power for the first time inside the MCU. Here, for the first time, America is positioned as a secondary earthly superpower. Wakanda has clear technological superiority. Shuri is even critical of Stark and Banner's tech, the already incredibly advanced vision. They also have immense existing wealth in the form of their unique natural resource, vibranium. When T'Challa decides to reveal Wakanda to the world at the UN, his liaison with America agent Ross advises against it, suggesting that he's going to scare a lot of people in there. When T'Challa speaks, he does so as a beneficiary. He will share his technology, his resources, etc. This quickly positions him as the most advanced and powerful nation in the UN. He speaks of unification and an end to conflict and needless warring. It signals the beginning of the end of infighting on Earth in the MCU, the coming threats more otherworldly and fantastical, again leaving behind the more political aspirations of the earlier movies, and moving towards a more progressive agenda of pushing a fantastical version of humanity that is moving past notions of warfare. America's power shift is also demonstrated by the Ross dynamic. General Ross is hardline, nationalist, and rigid. He insists and forces and does backroom deals. On the other hand, Martin Freeman's Ross is more fluid, respectful of Wakandan power and the on-screen heroes. Dignified, maybe, but still ultimately reserved and passive. Wakanda's position above America is cemented by their decision to fund community projects in America in a clear reversion of the usual axiom of charity. Here an African nation is supporting the infrastructure of a Western nation that up until now has been the dominant force on the planet. Not only does this film destabilize the traditional power structure of America, it also begins presenting a different form of American government. Not the war-hungry generals of Iron Man or the corrupt agencies of Winter Soldier, something more backseat and less dominant. It seems the decisions made in Black Panther are at least being stuck to so far. In Infinity War, Wakanda serves as the last bastion of humanity's defense against Thanos during the movie. Its advanced shielding is able to keep Thanos' forces at bay for a short time, or more accurately, it actually served as the last bastion of humanity's defense once New York had been invaded one more time by a foreign enemy from the sky. But the invasion is worldwide, the threat larger than global even. This is another step further away from the nationalist, America-centric films seen early in the franchise. It also ends the notion of Captain America as the insurgent, restoring him not as protector of America but protector of the world. His decision is signaled by his literal emerging from the shadows after being absent for the first portion of the film. By Endgame, Cap will very much return to a more America-centric aesthetic, and his more traditional ideals of soldiering, love for Peggy Carter, and so on. The Russo brothers described this shift as a return from insurgent to grizzled war vet, another iconic archetype of heroic American masculinity. But it is indeed still a film that is obsessed with trauma and loss, with failure at the hands of a foreign invader, a surprise attack that no one saw coming, consuming almost the entire plot. In fact, the same narratives of trauma, revenge, and prevention fantasy play out on a two-movie scale. Infinity War is the trauma, this time more resounding and impactful perhaps because it actually plays out. For the first time, it isn't bloodless catastrophe. The body count is immeasurable, quantifiable only as half of infinity. Instead of unbelievably low, the body count is now unimaginably high. The effect is largely the same in that most of the tragedy isn't really brought home or dwelled upon on screen because the body count is literally unimaginable. We instead just see the loss of our key characters rather than shots of swathes of the population being cut out. It's kept very personal. This would be too much for a movie intended for universal audiences, and it doesn't alter the meaning, ultimately. Half of the life of the universe was very much annihilated. As we've covered, now we're further away from the event, things can be more complicated, more brutal. Trauma narratives will inevitably become more and more aggressive as they need to outdo themselves, and as we as a public become more comfortable with past traumas. In fact, the films finally provide Thor with meaningful self-doubt and personal conflict. Thor is mostly ineffectual in the face of Thanos' attack. Even his eventual revenge attack against Thanos does nothing to prevent the catastrophe, and it is this failure that provides Thor with his trauma throughout Endgame. Just like America, he has finally become vulnerable, his notions of immortality and infallibility brought crumbling down, and subsequently he spends a large portion of the movie questioning his manhood and his own heroism. His revenge attack may be brutal and one-sided, as with the War on Terror, but it provides no solaces for the countless lives lost. He's got all the power in the world, but it only ever seems to be destructive power. He is powerless to bring back those he lost. Rather than America losing faith in Superman, this is Superman losing faith in himself. But as with Avengers Assemble, Age of Ultron, and many others, we are still allowed our prevention fantasy post-catastrophe through the time-traveling events of Avengers Endgame. The end result is still quite violent, but the vast majority of the disaster and body count are now prevented through American heroism. Again, it's the same post 9/11 trauma, prevention, and revenge fantasy we see across the MCU. It's much less concerned with America than it may have been in Iron Man 1, but the narrative patterns are very much the same. It's odd to think about how many of the MCU films fit this pattern, especially when the comics are so often concerned with things like crime, bank robberies, supervillain team-ups, all these different ways conflict can manifest, and yet we keep getting told the same cycle of trauma, rebuilding, and revenge. There's nothing bad about that, it's just another indicator that this is all something that has captured the public consciousness. And as with much of what I'm saying, it's now in the process of being phased out by Marvel, as I think will be much more clear once Spider-Man Far From Home hits theatres. Endgame also sees Tony and Steve given very satisfying conclusions to their character arcs. Tony actually begins Endgame traumatized enough to have doubled down on the Civil War Avengers 2 ideals of a suit of armor around the world, perhaps abandoning the more cavalier humanity first, nothing else matters attitude he displayed during Infinity War. Certainly a step backwards in terms of how his character was progressing. With distance from the event, however, he is able to contextualize his trauma and ultimately move on, amplified in no small part by becoming a father. His heroism and masculinity are reinvigorated, and he agrees to Ant-Man's plan, and the Avengers are able to complete the time heist. Tony's decision to sacrifice himself during the final events of Endgame redeemed the final portion of his character, the most problematic part and the one we've largely been concerned with throughout this video, that of the military leader, the drone operator. Tony proves he is the sort of guy that would jump on the grenade, that would make the sacrifice for his brothers in arms. This is perhaps surmised best in his final repetition of the line, "I am Iron Man," before the snap of his fingers. On a personal note, I think this is mainly said out of laconic rebellion. Thanos says, "I am inevitable," and his reply is everything from "inevitability didn't count on Tony Stark" to "there'll always be a Tony here to stop you," and so on. It's a perfect answer. But when we consider it in context with the other times he's said it in the MCU, and the overall sacrifice he is making here, it's pretty clear he's also saying, this is Iron Man. This is what Iron Man does when there's no options left. He gives up his life for the greater good. This is of course redemptive of how American military leadership and decision-making has been portrayed through the MCU and criticized in popular culture. Here we see they do care about the individual, that the leaders are perfectly willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good they're invested in. It's redemptive fantasy, but it works tremendously well at what it does. With Cap, we see similar fantasy played out. His character has always opposed Tony. He is the soldier rather than the general. And here, again, we see redemptive fantasy. Steve is simply able to jump through time and be reunited with his post-war love, essentially being given the happily ever after, not commonly associated with soldiering, but so often associated with heroism. Both ideals of national manhood are maintained and granted mythic status here. Generals that sacrifice their lives for the men on the front lines, and soldiers that survive every war and live to be 100 years old with their sweetheart. It's the perfect end to the saga of boyhood fantasy and reinvigoration of American national manhood, but I think it's safe to say it's put to rest now. American trauma may never fully be healed from the attacks, but I think it's safe to say it's been able to work out a lot of its cultural anxieties through these characters. Christine Muller said, "The defining events of the War on Terror era thus become replayed in the MCU through the melodramatic spectacle of the superhero genre. And naturally, I couldn't agree with this more. If we apply it broadly to what we've covered here, then Iron Man is largely American military intervention overseas, legitimizing the war on terror, and sanitizing drone strikes. Captain America is America's prior patriotism being replaced by distrust through the ongoing conflict. Avengers 1 and 2 replayed the trauma of the attacks on New York, and I think here with Infinity War and Endgame, we again get given the trauma of the attacks, reified this time, and the strength but essential impotence of the revenge attack in Endgame. We see how easily the enemy is defeated and is hollow, it doesn't change anything. Then obviously we get the prevention fantasy from time travel and the redemption and hopefully permanent salvation of American heroism. So one thing that slipped my mind thus far, that is to me at least highly indicative of this franchise's concern with national manhood, is the overall mixed nationalities of the female heroes. Remember when I pointed out that the majority of these heroes are American? Well, the logic that these are just the characters and that's how they were originally written falls down here. We'd expect to see the same thing. Female heroes are majority American in the comics, just like the male ones, but we don't see that in the films. Instead, we have a pretty broad variation. Captain Marvel is American, Black Widow is Russian, Okoye is Wakandan, Peggy Carter is English, Gamora, Nebula, Mantis are all alien. Hope Van Dyne is traditionally an American character, but I'm not sure that's made explicit in the MCU, and Evangeline Lilly is Canadian. The answer is, again, the whole point of this video. America was reinvigorating national manhood, so it was important the men on screen were iconic to America. The same isn't necessarily true for the women. Now, this doesn't really say anything negative about the women. Diverse representation and variation in our characters is very important, and it's been very well received. But I think the disparity does go further to demonstrating my point, that this has been in many ways a series of movies concerned with reinvigorating American masculinity through heroic male archetypes. Now, there has been some academic criticism suggesting that these movies reinforce and perpetuate hegemonic ideals and hegemonic masculinity. To quickly understand what hegemonic means, just think the dominant mode, so traditionally it's white males, but not necessarily. Now, I will say that national manhood and hegemonic masculinity are very closely linked, one more so to do with nationalism and the other more to do with power. I think it's fair to say, as we've discussed, that there are moments where ideals of hegemonic masculinity are reinforced. Honestly, across, let's say, 25 feature films, it would be extremely difficult to not have points where that happens. But where I think these theories fall down, especially the ones that will call the MCU chauvinistic or racist, where I think they fall down is their ignorance towards the amount of progressive and liberal messaging that's put out through the MCU as well. Now, this video has largely been looking at how it's linked with national manhood, but we could make an equal video discussing diversity or strong messages for children. There's a lot to unpack, and being able to pick and choose moments that aren't exactly third-wave feminist friendly is almost certain, but I think the MCU as a whole represents something extremely positive for cultural morality. Another thing I'd like to bring up quickly is the idea of representation as a revolving door. As Americans stormed Baghdad, they played Back in Black through tank speakers and were knowingly self-referential about kill counts and Call of Duty. Everyone is influenced by media in some way or another, it's inescapable. Most people are influenced by it a lot, I know I sure am. If I binge watch The Sopranos, you could be damn sure I'll spend the next week speaking an unforgivably bad Italian-American accent. So it's worth noting that while everything I've said regarding the War on Terror and 9/11's influence on the MCU is, I think, extremely accurate, the same can also be said in return. It's extremely unlikely that a cultural property with the size and scope of the MCU has just gone completely unseen by members of military forces around the world. Of course they've seen it. America certainly believes as much. It spends a truly incredible amount of money every year propagandizing its own military through media. And to go even further, the MCU could well be the boyhood influence of someone who will grow up to participate in future wars. Just as AC/DC and Call of Duty may have been the sardonic references for soldiers in Iraq, I can imagine an exoskeletoned US soldier chalking "I am Iron Man" onto the side of his robot suit in the next 10 years. And if I can imagine it, you know the US military has already been researching it for years. And this is what I mean. Art imitates life, life imitates art. It's a revolving door of representation. It's why understanding how relationships like this work, like we've done here today, is so important, and it's something that the American military understands very well. Lastly, all of this isn't meant to be conspiratorial. It's designed to be academic. There's no secret committee coordinating between Disney and the War on Terror. It's a combination of factors: the national psyche, trends in cinema, that are influenced by real-life events, simply what film companies think the public will pay to see, and so on. And I'm certainly not using this to criticize Marvel, as I hope is clear by the length and depth of this video. I'm kind of a comics fan. All this subtext and layered meaning shouldn't make the movies less awesome, in fact quite the opposite. And ultimately, I don't think it's a bad thing for American filmmakers and American companies making films that are pro-American. I just find it extremely interesting unpacking how these relationships and cultural issues play out in the zeitgeist of our entertainment. And damn, yeah, I think that's where we're going to leave it for now. This was so much fun. It was a whole lot of work, but so much fun to do. I originally intended to have sections on DC and Fox superhero movies too, but this just got so vast, looking at only Marvel, that I thought it better to streamline wherever possible. There is obviously a lot to say regarding the War on Terror and Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. If that's something you'd like to see me cover, then please let me know. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. If you did, then please consider giving the video a share and a subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. Next upcoming video is likely going to be dissecting what makes a great battle scene on film. We'll be looking at Battle of Winterfell, Battle of the Bastards, Battle of King's Landing, Helm's Deep, obviously, and lots of other ones. It's going to be awesome. And that's everything. Thank you so much, guys, if you've actually listened to all of this. Peace.